This presentation covers figure basing ideas and how to achieve different basing outcomes. Many gamers do not base their 6mm figures, and I was one of them for many years. However, I came to the realization that basing your figures was the best strategy, especially if playing platoon, or higher scale rules. These rules require elements to have specific frontages. Coupled with this was storage. Once you have based an element, you can store them in felt-covered boxes, with spaces 3 cm wide, which allow you to tightly fit your figures into them. This protects your figures and allows you to transport them without the risk of them being damaged. But for me, the final trigger was I kept on forgetting what my figures were. Was this AT34-76E or AT34-76F, for example? By basing them, I could identify them on the bottom of the base. However, even for those players who do not base their figures, they still have to base infantry and artillery. This shows you my current basing system, which I am not happy with. The flock is too coarse and does not look attractive when you look at it close up. My original objective was to use a flock similar to the flock on my terrain, and I must admit, when you look at a whole playing area with elements on it, it does look acceptable. But close up, especially for infantry, it did not look realistic or good. I started flocking Cold War forces, which had little infantry, so this problem was not so obvious. Once I started playing World War II games, the flaws became very obvious, as well as not giving me good close-up photos. I have downloaded a number of photos from the internet to determine what other gamers were doing. In this example, infantry are being mixed with Soviet armor. The best thing about these bases was the use of grass patches. These are typical resin bases, which I will not be adopting. While I am not a fan of resin bases, these bases match the playing area terrain reasonably well, which is an important consideration when making your bases. These are more photos of the brown resin bases with patches of grass. I am uncertain what the bases are made of, but I suspect it's resin, which is thick, probably more than 2 mm. The best thing about resin is it allows you to merge your infantry into the base, thus avoid having their bases being visible. This looks good, but my playing area terrain is mainly green, so brown bases would not match. This brings up an important point: the bases need to match your playing area terrain. Before deciding what base effect you wish, you need to confirm what type of playing area you will mainly be playing on. In this case, the bases matches the playing area, which I can see in the photo. This also uses grass patches, but the base seems to be brown flock and the edges of the base are green. This would match a green playing area and would match my playing area terrain. Again, I was struck by how effective a two-tone effect was. I feel this is a critical element of having a good base scheme. I do like these bases. This shows a range of bases. 2 are similar to what we have seen, but the bottom right is interesting. Part of one base displays the vehicle type. This is something I always want to avoid, which is writing on the bases. While I understand why players do this, I feel it does not look good at all. I feel the vehicle type can be placed on the bottom of the base, something which I will show later in this video. On the left is an excellent base of infantry with a mortar. Not only do we see the two-tone effect, but some extra features, which in this case are boxes of ammo. The top 2 images are standard green two-tone bases with infantry, although on the right the brown edges are not ideal. Obviously this base was painted brown and then clumps of grass added to it. I think retaining green edges, like the figure on the left, is better. But both are nice bases. The lower 2 bases look like very large bases with 6mm figures on them. These are almost diorama and they look very nice. I am uncertain if I would go to this effort. More examples of two-tone bases on the top, brown bases with green grass. The bottom are single tone, but with interesting contrast effects on the base. My preference is the base at the top left, it looks very good. A multi-tone desert base which is very detailed. The terrain looks like resin, but the actual bases look like very thin MDF. They could even be metal. Many gamers base figures on thin metal, which can stick to a magnet. They use this for storage purposes and that system is very good. I don't like metal bases because the flock comes off too easily. More detailed desert-themed bases, in this case with some grass included and infantry wandering around the vehicles. I am uncertain if I would mix infantry with vehicles, unless it's a headquarters, but as headquarters these look good. This is very interesting. I have no idea how the yellow-brown effect is done, but it looks nice. The base is very thick, I suspect it's 3 mm MDF. More two-tone bases and once again I do not know how the rocky effect is done. These do look good. As a warning to the viewers, I am not going to this level of detail, so if you wish to copy this effect you need to work out how it's done yourself. These are large bases, perhaps 5 cm wide. Once again nice diorama, and it shows what you can do if you want to use 15 mm sized bases for your 6 mm figures. The grass effect is very nice. These bases are moving towards what I am thinking of. The green looks like a type of flock which is run over some type of rocky material. The base in the center left, with the green edges, would suit my playing area and is very good. This may not be World War II, but looks very interesting. Once again green tufts of grass. Now I am stealing some instructions from another video. The link to the video is in the title and I will try and make sure it's in the YouTube description so you can check it out. Here we have a MDF base, which could be 2 mm or 3 mm. I normally use 2 mm cardboard, but this is a good solution as well. I have used MDF bases in the past, but these were 3 mm thick and I am uncertain if I want a base that thick. The base is painted with black-grey, it's not a pure black and it's more a slate grey or very dark grey. I do not use a paint and instead use a sheet of paper on my cardboard, which is the same shade as the first flock layer. The key point is the base must not be lighter than the first layer of flock. I used to paint the base, but found painting cardboard can sometimes warp it. This is not an issue with MDF and I am thinking that MDF may be a superior solution. My MDF bases use a house paint called plasticine, which is a dark middle green. This is too dark and I will use a lighter shade house paint for this video. The first flock layer uses woodland dirt, which is a dark brown fine flock. My MDF bases uses a lighter brown, earth, or a medium green. I tend to create lighter colored bases, but if a dark base is what you want to achieve, this is a good solution. The glue used is a hobby glue, which dries slowly and is not as thick as my exterior wood glue. Make sure the glue is fully dry before going to the next step. Parts of the base, with dirt, is dabbed with watered down craft glue and then a middle green fine flock is added. This is a darker green than I would normally use, but does look good. Make sure the glue is fully dry before going to the next step. The next step is to place some multicolored rocks on the base. The rocks are railway ballast and you should try and find a range of colors. In the video super glue is used, but I suspect this can be done better with exterior PVA wood glue. Spread out the rocks and the final effect is very good. I would keep the rocks away from the center as much as possible, otherwise your vehicle will not sit well on the base. I normally do not put any rocks on my base, but I will consider trying it out to see what the effect is. I think it would look best on bases which have infantry on them. I would probably miss this step, but some wood shavings are added. This was created by blending, in a blender, dried leaves. Watered down craft glue is used here. The final layer is clumpy green flock using craft glue. Only a few spots are done and the result is some depth, which is a good look. I normally use a very light green brush flock, and before I do this I spray the base with a watered down solution of PVA, to ensure the base flock does not flake off. The final step is to place the figure on the base. You need to first press the model on the base to make sure it sits flat on the base. Craft glue is used, but in this case I would use a hardware PVA wood glue as it's much stronger, or even super glue. This looks very good, however it's a bit dark for my tastes, so I would consider a lighter shade. The colors used are entirely based on personal preferences. Most base color schemes are very dark, which is a system I originally used. I am now more focused on lighter colors, with the image showing the base color of my playing area. My playing areas are slightly darker because it's covered with a protective layer of PVA glue and has other, darker, colors in the terrain. In most instructions they suggest starting with a dark color and layering lighter colors over it. I have gone for the opposite. My bases are a light green and I layer the other, darker, colors over it. Players can choose whichever system they feel gives them the best result. My major objection to MDF is its thickness, however I have found 2 mm MDF bases which are available from the UK. The cost is reasonable, but the shipping costs are very high, so I would make sure you order a lot to minimize the impact. The shipping to Tokyo is £9.50 minimum, and the shipping of 2 packets is the same as 1, so I expect you can order several packets for the same shipping cost. The shop is close to Swansea, which is a very nice holiday location but nowhere near my office, so it's unlikely I can stock up next time I go to merry old England. eBay has them as well, but shipping from the US is even more expensive. I will investigate this in more detail, but for now my video will cover the much cheaper cardboard alternative and my current homemade 3mm MDF bases. While I think the M1 base looks great, there is a big difference between modeling and gaming. The bases you can see here are bland and far too coarse, but it matches the playing area. If I placed the M1 figure on my playing area it would be too dark and too busy. The darkness can be resolved by using a different flock and colors, but it's important the figure is not too busy. The bases I use are 30mm by 30mm. The M1 looked like it used a base which was 30mm by 20mm, so it would not have an issue with being too busy. But on a larger base it's important to avoid making it too busy. I will now cover how and why I use cardboard as my base for figures. I have to admit I will try a 3mm MDF base system to see how it compares, as I do like many aspects of that system. Back to my cardboard, I use 1.75mm or 2mm cardboard. This can be purchased in large-sized sheets from a craft shop. The 2mm cardboard is superior, but it's much harder to cut. 1.75mm is easy enough to cut with my scorpion dressmaking scissors, which is a brute. I use exterior PVA woodwork glue, because it dries quickly and is very thick, so there is minimal moisture absorption. This shows the first stage of glue application. Make sure the glue covers every part of the cardboard. The last thing you need is the colored sheets rising on your base. An alternative is to paint the bases. this works well and I normally use watered down house paint for this. I have had problems with warping, but I must admit it's not serious. I mainly use cardboard to thicken my base. If I was using MDF this would not be required. In this case I am using a light brown sheet. I also use light green, dark green and dark brown. It all depends on the flock I am placing on top. This is the light green base. This color matches my playing area green and is the main color theme I need to achieve. It's critical to make sure the color sheet sticks fully to the cardboard. For this I use a number of heavy books, each of which is covered by plastic contact. PVA glue does not stick to clear plastic, so if the glue comes out of the edges it's not an issue. In this case I have 2 sheets under a book and my brown sheet will be covered by another book. I use my trusty Conway's Fighting Ships to cap off all the other books, because it's very heavy. This is the main reason I use cardboard. The front of the cardboard has had these sheets stuck to them. This way the bottom of each of my bases contains a description of what the vehicle is. Because this has to be rules agnostic, only the figure description is included. If I use MDF I can always print stickers, which I can use on the bottom of my MDF bases. That way I can achieve the same result using MDF bases. These are the bases after all the gluing has been completed and they are cut out into 12 base strips. This shows a strip on its side. The cardboard is 1.75 mm thick, with colored paper on one side and the printed paper on the other. This thickness is about 2 mm. This is one of the dangers of my system of using cardboard. If the glue is not spread correctly and pressed down enough, using books, it can lift. MDF would solve this, however these are very old figures and these days I never have this issue. Incidentally, these figures are homemade, which is why they are so poor quality. I use these figures for testing purposes and I will be using them to test my new basing ideas. Another example of lifting, but the figure in the center is more typical. This is rather boring, which is why I am looking at implementing a new basing system. The figures are homemade so they are poor quality. These are the scissors I use to cut my cardboard and these are very dangerous scissors indeed. I have cut myself many times and if you go down this route I urge you to be very careful. Incidentally these are huge, but it cuts through thick cardboard like a hot knife through butter. The edges of the base must be colored. This can be done with paint, or with a whiteboard marker. While a whiteboard marker is easier to use I am moving back to paint as the color consistency is superior. But for people who lack a garage and are making their bases in a flat or house, this does allow you to avoid the use of paint. This section covers my guide on basing using homemade 3mm MDF bases. Personally I would use the professional 2mm bases, which can be obtained from a number of sources. But if you want a cheap solution, this is a valid option. I have selected some preliminary colors, which I suspect will not be satisfactory but will show how I have created my MDF bases. The old figures on the old bases are shown at the top and the painted MDF bases at the bottom left. These are handmade and painted with a diluted house paint. The color I have selected matches green or brown flock. At the bottom right is my test base showing the flocked color effect. I am first applying the light green flock. The bases are lined up and a blob of glue is placed on each. I use my finger to evenly spread it. You can water it down a bit and use a brush, but I find this less messy and has a similar effect. You will see my art trowel in the center. I use this to apply any glue in a controlled manner. Once again you can water down your glue and brush it on, but I find this as effective. You will see how I do this when I apply the second flock. My trusty finger has done its work. Make sure all surfaces are covered and try not to make it too thick. The one benefit of the brush technique is the glue will typically not be too thick. Press each base into the flock and then tap any excess flock off the base, either with a metal object or your fingers. I tend to do the latter, even though it does leave some loose flock on the base. As I spray the base with a water PVA solution, this loose flock is secured then. All the bases are flocked and now we leave them to dry. I normally dry overnight or 24 hours. This is to ensure there is no residual wet glue problems when I apply the next flock. It's 24 hours later and I am ready to put the second flock on the bases. In this case I am using NOC green flock. When applying the glue there are many ways of doing this. In this example place a blob of glue on the trowel and apply where it's required. The other method is to place a drop of glue on the base and then use the trowel to spread around as required. The former gives you more control, the latter is quicker. This is another system, in this case with my final flock choice. In this video the example uses a flock which is designed to provide depth and is not suitable as a foundation to my bases. I found some fine flock from NOC which matches the colors I require. While I feel Woodlands provides a superior fine flock, their colors are all too dark for me. The same applies with Faller. Only NOC has a light green and medium green flock and now I have found a fine turf version. I am standardizing on this. If you prefer a darker color then I strongly advise you to use Woodlands and I may consider using this with my NATO West German Army, as it matches the camouflage and Central European conditions. During World War II in Europe most fighting was done in a drier area, thus the lighter base color and even camouflage colors. The second layer is applied, now to wait for 24 hours for the next step. A comment about the flock and the reason why I will probably abandon this flock selection. This NOC fine flock has significant depth, it's fluffy. This is excellent for a final flock, but not a base flock arrangement. The optimal initial flock layers is a fine turf, similar to the example which is shown at the start of his video, the one with the M1 tank. This gives you a much better effect. The base is ready to be sprayed with a diluted solution of PVA. The reason why I do this is to reduce the amount of flock which comes off my figures. I find everything associated with my hobby has a layer of flock everywhere. If I cover the flock with glue this will be minimized. Players can skip this step if this is not a problem. After the spraying, my spray bottle can be seen in the top right corner. Glue will get everywhere, so place your bases on a plastic surface. This is an example, but the best surface should be smooth to avoid any bumps forming under the bases. Under the plastic container you can see a white sheet of paper. This is a sheet of paper on a 3mm MDF board and covered with plastic contact. I placed the bases on this after the photo was taken. You may choose to skip this step, but I stick a description of the figure under the base. On the left is my descriptions, printed on thick paper. These images can be downloaded from the IO Group CryExpel site. Use hardware quality exterior PVA glue, because it's thicker. Place a small amount on the base and evenly spread across the entire base. The labels have been applied. You will notice the paper curls. Place these bases, bottom down, on a sheet of plastic, or book covered with plastic, and then place a book covered with plastic on top. This is to press the label down. Some trimming in this case is required, but that is because my bases are homemade and not exactly a 3 cm square. The labels are now dry and it's time to mount the figure and any extra terrain. In this example I am placing a couple of bushes on each base. On the left shows the glue for the bushes applied, using my trowel. In the center I have placed the bushes on the glue. I simply use my fingers to pick up a small amount of the fibers and place it on the glue. On the right shows the figure mounted on the base. In this case I am using PVA glue to mount the figure. If the base was flatter I would use super glue. The main benefit of super glue is if you decide to rebase the figure, it's easier to get the figure off the base without any residue. With PVA there will be residue which requires some careful effort to remove. The bases have been completed, it just now needs to dry. The white glue will disappear within 24 hours. The top left figure is a real figure, the rest are test homemade figures which I use to test paint jobs and basing. You may need to use a knife to trim the edges, but this is not necessary. A slightly out of focus close-up. Please excuse the poor quality paint job. I will not proceed with this flock arrangement as the knock flock I used provides a depth effect, which gives a nice realistic variation in the base, but the actual color has an unrealistic feel to it. This type of flock is best used as a final spotted effect, similar to the bush. This concludes my video on basing figures. I have covered a number of different suggestions you could consider in creating bases for your figures. I must admit I am warming to the idea of 3mm bases, it does make it very easy to pick up your base. This is especially important for infantry and towed guns, where there may not be much to pick up. From a gaming point of view this may be optimal, so before I order the 2mm MDF bases I will have a few games with my homemade 3mm MDF bases.